did have the honor of co-chairing the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the practice of democratic citizenship. And we released a report in June called Our Common Purpose, as Professor Berkman said, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. But I want to tell you the story of how this work came about and what it really adds up to. I will come around to talking about some of our recommendations, but first I'd rather tell you about the people and what we did. I think we all know at this point that there are signs of ill health all around us in our democracy. Each of us probably has a different story of when exactly we came to think that something was wrong. In my own case, the moment the alarm bells went off for me was 2013, when Congress had a 9% approval rating. Now, I'm a student of the history of political thought and democratic theory, and so I'm steeped in the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries and how they thought about self-government and the potential for free and equal self-governing citizens to form effective governments. A key feature of their arguments was that in order to govern itself, a people had to have a voice. And the way a people had a voice was by forming a legislature, a body of lawmakers who would articulate the will of the people. Congress is our voice. It is the first branch. It is the first article in the Constitution because it is the anchor for free self-government. So when Congress had an approval rating of 9%, what that meant was that the people didn't approve of its own voice. And when that's the situation, you know your democracy is broken. So that 2013 moment was my first alarm bell moment. There are other alarm bells. Another one that just rang really loudly for me was data about the differences across generations in terms of how attached we are to our democracy. So for the generational cohort born before World War II, it continues to be the case that members of that cohort consider it essential to live in a democracy. At the rate about 70% of that cohort thinks that. For people who are under 40, though, millennials, as we call you all, that rate is barely 30%. All right, so somehow we have failed at the work of generational transmission and succession. We have failed to pass from one generation to the next an understanding of love for, commitment to constitutional democracy. Now, the falling away by younger generations from our constitutional democracy is not exactly just the fault of younger generations, not by any stretch of the imagination. We haven't invested in civic education, for one thing, but it's also the case that our institutions have been plainly broken. For a lot of young people, they have just clearly not delivered in response to things like the climate crisis or to issues of racial justice and questions of policing and the like. So the fact that there's disaffection from our political institutions comes from something. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from the fact that actually we're not governing effectively for ourselves or for the ends that people see as important. So I was not alone by any stretch of the imagination. Many others have had alarm bells like this over the course of the past decade. And about 3 years ago, some folks at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences started reaching out and finding others who agreed in this way and committing to running a commission. Now, a commission is often a sort of group of experts who sit around and do research and write papers, but we wanted to do something different. The American Academy dates back to 1780. It was founded by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and people like that, people who thought that the new republic, the young constitutional democracy, would always need knowledge, resources to help it get out of times of trouble. So we took that mission and that history seriously and thought of our job as really being about connecting to our society across America to think through the question of what are the challenges and obstacles to achieving healthy democracy now in the 21st century. So as Professor Berkman said, we ran listening sessions all over the country. And our question to people was always, what is your relationship to this democracy? If you are participating, then what motivates you to participate? And if you're not, what's keeping you away? What are the challenges that make participation a problem? We talked to all kinds of people, older people, younger people, non-voters, as well as voters, naval cadets, people who are in service industries, service workers, people all over, ideologically diverse groups of people as well. And one of the striking things about this was we thought that we were going to hear a lot of different stories everywhere, and we did hear different things. But we also heard some surprising similarities. one of the first things was that we discovered that Americans do share something. And this is the idea that we don't share anything at all. So everywhere we went, if we asked people, well, what do you think Americans share? They would say, I don't think we share anything. So the paradox is we actually share this worry that we don't share anything. And lodged inside that worry was a yearning to be reconnected, a yearning to share. So we found that everywhere. Again, it didn't matter what generation, it didn't matter what social background, it didn't matter what race or ethnicity. We found a yearning for reconnection. We also found an interesting thing that everybody could articulate a story of love of country. People have very different reasons for feeling love of country, and people are in very different situations. This country has not been good to everybody, but even for people from backgrounds that have been subjected to domination or oppression, people express a love of place, of where they grew up, of the geography of the landscape, of people, of community. And it seemed to become important that there be chances for people to all tell their stories of love of country. They're different stories. We do not need a same story. We do not need one story, but it is beneficial. It's helpful to hear all the different reasons people across this country do love their country. So we started inviting people to tell those stories, and that was also really profound. And as we did that, we discovered all kinds of solutions, the ways in which in communities people were finding ways of achieving responsive government or finding pathways to empowerment. I remember a pastor in Washington State who took an old coffee shop that had been abandoned and turned it into a combination of a faith center and a social services center, and started bringing together a sort of suburban worshiping community with a community of people who were homeless or dealing with substance use disorder to solve local problems. He was connecting people, responding to that yearning for connection, but also empowering people by the work of local organizing. So as we did this work and heard these stories and found solutions, we also heard from people who gave us a really clear diagnosis of what had gone wrong for all of us in our constitutional democracy, and therefore how things could go right. So the first contribution of our report is a conceptual contribution, and I want to give you that now. I want to share that with you. There was a participant from a listening session in Maine who said something along the lines of, look, our institutions are broken. They're not responsive. They're dysfunctional. And as a result, who wants to participate in them? We don't participate in organizations that might pull us into connection, because why bother? And when that happens, you end up not having a culture of connection to your cultural civic life, sort of also degrades. He said, we end up in this vicious cycle. He says, isn't the goal, we need to be in a virtuous cycle. We need to be in a virtuous cycle. And he was right. And what did he mean when he said we needed to be in a virtuous cycle? He was sharing the idea that any healthy constitutional democracy depends on political institutions that empower people, that deliver equality of voice, that are responsive. And then it depends as well on a civil society and civil society organizations that pull people into participation and also help them bridge social differences and give them an information ecosystem that empowers them to participate effectively in our civic life. And as people start to participate in civil society as a part of linking back up to participating in our political institutions, you also need to nourish the roots of a civic culture of mutual commitment to one another and of commitment to our constitutional democracy, a recognition that democracy is a team activity. It is about problem solving together, even though we have massive and serious disagreements. So that's the virtuous circle that we need for a healthy democracy: healthy institutions, a civil society that helps people bridge differences, and a civic culture that nourishes a sense of mutual commitment of all of us to one another. So as we worked on our report, we therefore sought to sketch out strategies of response and specific solutions that would do all three of those things. So there's no silver bullet to solving the problems of polarization or inequality that we currently experience in our democracy. Instead, we have to work on all three of these dimensions at the same time. So I want to give you just a few examples of some of the recommendations that we made and think out loud with you about how they contribute across all three of those dimensions. So under the category of empowering voters achieving equality of representation, we are recommending that we increase the size of Congress. all right? We recommend an increase by at least 50 seats or a target of around 500 being reasonable, but it could go higher than that. The British Parliament and the German legislature are both bigger than our Congress. Our Congress was capped artificially by legislation in the 1920s as a part of a fight over the census. And it wasn't supposed to be capped. When the Constitution was first designed, the size of the House of Representatives was supposed to grow steadily with the population. So we need to return to that notion that the House, the size of the House, adjusts with our population. The result of having capped the size of the House is that now votes in California, for example, have a lot less weight than a vote in Wyoming. There's a real imbalance between the more populous and the less populous parts of the country. Importantly, it's not just that there's this sort of imbalance in representation in Congress, but that imbalance flows through to the Electoral College. After all, the Electoral College consists of a combination of electors that number the same number of the members of the House plus the number of the members of the Senate put together, right? That's how we get the Electoral College. So when we capped Congress in its size, we also put a dynamic in place whereby over time, as the country became more urbanized and as populations balance shifted from rural to urban contexts, we had a problematic shift in the weighting of the Electoral College. The Electoral College was designed to protect the smaller, less populous states in the Union, for sure. That's the job it had to do. But it was doing that job with a very delicate weighting. And the capping of Congress has meant that the protection afforded to less populous states has simply grown in scale. This leaves us now in a position where it's a reasonably probable likelihood that we can see a split between the popular vote in an election for president and the Electoral College vote. Now, routine, repeated splits between those kinds of votes will simply undermine the legitimacy of our institutions. It's okay if such a split is a rare probability event, a low probability event, but it's not okay if it's a higher probability event. So the time has come really to address this issue and to find a way to rebalance the Electoral College. And the way to do that is by permitting Congress to grow again, as was originally intended. So that is an example of a highly impactful change that requires nothing more than congressional legislation to achieve. The good news about such a change is it's not actually clear up front which party would benefit from such a change. So that means there is a space for bipartisan collaboration around an idea of that kind. And indeed, I didn't mention this about our commission, the 35 of us who worked on this report, but we spanned the ideological spectrum. We spanned geographies, we spanned demographies, we spanned academic disciplines and also professional sectors. So the recommendations that we produced really did come from a cross-ideological consensus. Now, it's a good thing to change institutions in that way, but at the same time that we're doing that work, we need to make sure those institutions are, again, connected to a healthy civil society and to a healthy civic culture. So as if we could have a bigger house and have improved voice, improved representation there, we also want to make sure that as we are working our way through political issues and debating political issues, we're doing that in a healthy media environment with healthy information ecosystems. One of the features of the current structure of our democratic life has been a great erosion of local news. Very little coverage of city governments, very little coverage of state houses and state governments. And the reason for this is because of the huge growth of social media companies. And so one of the things we advocate is the use of a tax on the targeted advertising revenue on media platforms to fund a public investment in local journalism, local investigative journalism. The argument is that the large social media corporations should help support the necessary democratic functions that they have actually displaced. And a well-informed public with full access to full range of news is a really important part of ensuring that the kind of representation that we're trying to achieve in Congress can function in a healthy way. In the third category of culture, there are a number of different investments. We think it's important for us all to spend time working on the question of how we narrate our shared history. But another key argument is that we should invest again in civic education, in equipping all young people and making opportunities of lifelong learning available, but equipping people with the knowledge and skills and dispositions needed for effective civic participation. In World War II, this country understood itself to be in a scientific competition. As the war was unfolding, it was clear that the Germans were seeking to build an atom bomb in order to shift the balance of power in the war. And as a result of this, here in the US, we initiated something called the Manhattan Project. James Bryant Conant, who's then president of Harvard, secured massive federal government investment in the project and knit together research universities around the country to beat the Germans in the production of the bomb. They succeeded, they won, they did it. And that was the moment at which the federal government began investing seriously in sciences in our research universities. Those investments were followed in the Eisenhower years in response to the Soviet Union's launch of the first satellite into space, Sputnik. The concern, again, was that the US was going to fall behind in a global competition for security if we didn't invest in scientific knowledge and learning. So we made those investments. They were important and critical. And that approach continued over time. In the 80s, the concern was that we needed to achieve economic security and economic competitiveness in a global context. And again, the argument was that in order to achieve competitiveness in the economic sense, we needed to invest in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. And we made those investments. The result of making those investments is that we now find ourselves in a position where every year we're investing about $50 per kid of federal monies in STEM education and 5 cents per kid of federal monies in civic education. So you get what you pay for, and we have not been investing in civic education over the last 3 or 4 decades. This is something that we definitely need to rectify. The goal in achieving or pursuing competitiveness on a global stage is not to compete as any random country. We're trying to compete as a constitutional democracy. To do that, to be safe and secure in a global context, we need to really ensure that we have civic strength at home. And that civic strength is about the citizenry knowing how to use political institutions effectively, but it's also about our understanding how to bridge divides, how to find our way off battlegrounds and back to common ground. And civic education is not the only answer, but it's an important part of the answer for rebuilding our civic strength and ensuring that as we start to try to redesign our institutions, we can populate them with people who are committed to working together effectively and have a depth of knowledge about our history and our institutions in order to govern effectively. We've seen some of the breakdowns of governance in the past year through the pandemic as we've been struck by the complexity of our federalist system and have had difficulty figuring out how to operate it in order to deliver for ourselves the safety and security that we needed in response to COVID. We don't need to be ill-equipped with regard to understanding our system. Federalism provides great virtues, great benefits, and we can use it effectively to harmonize our effort and govern for the public good, for the common good. But in order to do that, we actually have to rebuild our understanding of the basic machinery, sort of needing to get out that user's manual and make sure that across our society, we have a deep understanding and acculturation in the best uses and best approaches to the machinery that we've built. So it's work across these dimensions, again, redesigning our institutions so that they are actually, from a matter of the incentives they create for office holders, working to our benefit, but also investing in civil society, again, for example, with the media corporations, such that the ecosystem of information in which we are all operating is healthy and supports our healthy participation in politics, and reinforcing constantly a healthy civic culture through civic education. Now, when we did this work for the commission, I said I was telling the story of this group of people who worked together. We set ourselves some parameters for the work. And so I want to close by just focusing on this aspect of what we did, because it was important to the shape of the recommendations that we made and our decisions. As I said, we were a cross-ideological group. And we wanted to find common ground, but we didn't want to just find mushy compromise that didn't mean anything. So we knew we were trying to do something different than the norm. We were sure that we wanted nothing but impactful recommendations, things that would make a meaningful difference and that would drive forward this sort of theory of change that I described with the virtuous circle. At the same time that we wanted bold and impactful recommendations, we also wanted feasible recommendations. So we were trying to find the sweet spot between the bold and the feasible. And as a result of that, there are a few things that we wanted to get that feasibility criterion. One was that we were looking for not perfect unanimity, but near consensus across ideological divides on every recommendation that we recommended. And so we achieved that. And no, it's not the case that everybody agreed about every single recommendation, but we all did agree unanimously about the whole package. And we had very significant degrees of consensus around every single recommendation. The second element of the feasibility test was one about what level of government would be required to bring this change about. We wanted to minimize the need, for example, for constitutional amendments and maximize the use of local government and state government, and then where necessary, relying on asking Congress to do something. But we saw great virtue in being able to activate local government and state government. There's a lot of work that can be done at that level, and that's the level at which people still trust government. About 70% of Americans still trust local government. So we can do good and important work there. And as we thought about the level at which to put different recommendations, the result was that there was only one recommendation that we ultimately said should be a constitutional amendment. And that was a recommendation for a constitutional amendment to undo the effects of Citizens United with regard to campaign finance. So we recommend an amendment that would declare that corporations are not persons protected by First Amendment privileges, that Bill of Rights protection applies to natural persons. And this would enable states, again, to regulate campaign finance and take the problem of money out of politics, a problem on which Americans broadly agree that we need a solution. So in bringing this work to doc, finally, we relied for inspiration on a quotation from Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention. On the very last day of the convention, he stood up and said, look, I don't think that this is the most perfect instrument that could ever have been devised, but I think it may be the least imperfect that is achievable at this point in time. And so I'm going to bury all reservations here, and the world will never know any of my reservations by anything in any of this, and I will put the full weight of my endorsement behind this. And that's what we asked of our commissioners as well, that they come together and consent unanimously around a package that we knew to be not perfect, but perhaps the least imperfect thing achievable at this point in time, and that we all bury our reservations. And so that's what we've done, and we are working hard and diligently on moving the recommendations forward with a big network of champions, civil society organizations from all over the country, trying to deliver meaningful progress on all 31 of our recommendations by 2026, the 250th anniversary of the country's founding. So I look forward to your questions and to talking more about our prospects for rebuilding democracy in the 21st century. Thank you so much.
Okay, that was terrific. So many questions already, and so much to chew on there. I think what I would like to start with is a kind of big question. Reading through the document, you can surely see this idea of trying to find the sweet spot between bold on the one hand and feasible on the other. And yet, of course, that so many of these are so far from possible right now. And you all almost get the sense like, in order to do any of this, that we need to do to make our government better, our government and politics would have to be much better. and so my first question is where do you start? What is given that you have these three prongs, is there any low-hanging fruit? Is there anything that you can kind of like point to as something that we can work on right now, as opposed to just hopefully someday we'll get there?
Well, every single thing in our report is something that somebody is already working on right now. So there is a champion for every single recommendation. And in many cases, those champions were working on the recommendations even before we released our report. So we have shown a spotlight on them and have encouraged people to sign up and assist them. But in terms of, if you're going to sort of sequence order of operations, right? Like what do you need to change first so that then you can change other things? I think a particularly important recommendation is for ranked choice voting. This is a voting mechanism whereby when you go to the polls, you don't just vote for your first choice, you vote for your first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and so forth. And then if there are many candidates in the race, you can effectively have an instant runoff where the lowest vote getter is removed if nobody has gotten past 50%. And everybody who voted for that person, then their votes get reallocated to their second choice person. And you keep sort of putting votes in the heaps of candidates until somebody gets past that 50% point. Now, this is a reform that is moderating. It means people have to campaign by building coalitions and finding that common ground to solve problems on. It undoes the dynamics of negative campaigning, for example, because you want to be the second choice of your opponent's voters. You don't want to just demonize your opponent. And this is a reform that is making progress around the country. New York City is about to try to use ranked choice voting for the first time in its upcoming mayoral election. Maine adopted ranked choice voting. Massachusetts has recently adopted ranked choice voting. And there's municipalities in the Bay Area, Minneapolis, Minnesota, that are also using it. So I think that's a good example of reform that has legs and that we will see sort of a snowball effect from that. Independent redistricting commissions are another, and both of those things give us a lot of power then also for driving change through Congress. So I think there's good reason to be hopeful that we really can get the ball across the finish line on some of these game changers up front that then will open up the possibilities for some of the harder ones.
Thank you. We have you mentioned this generational decline in terms of the, kind of commitment to democracy. And, that's certainly clear in the data, but it's also clear that that same decline, if at least as strong with respect to a commitment to capitalism,
Yeah.
right? And so a question came in, I think excluding a discussion, sorry, I gotta get this bigger. Excluding a discussion of how to make capitalism work better, more humanely and more fairly distributed as a foundation for democratic stability and longevity may have been a missed opportunity in the paper. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I do think that one of the things that's happening with younger generations is a conflation of the concepts of democracy and capitalism. So I do think that young people who are critics of capitalism think that they're also therefore critics of democracy. And it really is important to pull those two concepts apart from each other. Capitalism is a mode of economic production and economic relationships, whereas democracy is a structure for organizing political decision making. So that's just, I think, a really kind of important point to make from the get-go, and is an important one for all of us, I think, to bring out in conversation and in educational settings. That said, yes, the question of how a democracy operates in relationship to different kinds of political economy is hugely important. I wouldn't say that the question of political economy is missing actually from the report. It's subtle in its presence, but the basic premise and argument in the report is that a healthy political economy flows from a healthy democracy. Currently, we live in a democracy that absolutely has been captured by wealth elites. The data is very clear on that. That it is the interests of the best off that are coming out the end of the sausage making machine of legislation, the legislative process. So historians of the economy, historians of political economy have shown that in the 19th century in the UK, also in the US, it's been at moments when the people have been broadly re-empowered that you've also seen important economic reforms that have pulled the economy in a more egalitarian direction. So from our point of view, you've got to solve the political problems in order to solve the economic problems.
Chris, I have a question here about social media. So there's a lot of talk these days about the challenges that social media is presenting for democracy. Do you have thoughts about how social media companies can help democracy, a role that they might be able to play?
Well, so it's interesting. I do think this is one of the most important questions. And I think that there have to be many pieces to the answer here. I think some of it probably is about going ahead and investing in public media that functions in alternative ways. I think other parts of the question are about regulating social media and its practices so that it is democracy supporting, it aligns with some of our basic infrastructure.
Mhm.
For me, I think a useful analogy for thinking about social media is to urban design. So, we don't actually let cities grow in a higgledy-piggledy fashion. We have all kinds of policies and procedures that support the design of cities in ways that are productive of healthy human relationships and interactions, are good for the economy, give people access to things they need for well-being, like nature and parks and things like that. We can overdo it sometimes, right, with too much zoning. So we can see where urban design also goes wrong, and we can see other kinds of mistakes we make with urban design. I think basically social media platforms are like cities, and they have really just grown in a kind of higgledy-piggledy way. And it is time for us to bring the same design intentionality to them as we bring to our cities. So what that means in detail is a harder question, sort of depends on a lot of technical capacity issues. But let me just give you one tiny example. This comes not from any big kind of corporate conglomerate, but just a platform called Vermont Front Porch. I don't know if you've heard of this one. But this is a platform that was set up just to let neighbors in Vermont share information, talk about issues, generally participate in some sense in a kind of public sphere. And at this point, they've got about 60% or so of Vermont residents using this platform. So in that regard, it's highly successful as a creation of a kind of something that supports a democratic civil society public sphere. It has a few key design features that are quite different from our sort of standard social media platforms. One of them is that you can only post once a day. And that has a huge impact on the degree to which flame wars are likely to break out, because basically people don't stay mad for 24 hours. And that just sort of brings the temperature down on everything. So there's lots of intentionality that we can bring to how we design our digital communications platforms. And we could certainly do a better job of designing for democracy, as opposed to designing for what we currently design for, which is sort of contempt-driven audience growth. That's the basic problem, is that the algorithm is designed to maximize the sort of purchasing power of contempt. So we've got to move away from the use of algorithms of that kind.
Chris, did you have something?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that I'm going to try to summarize, or at least try to fix it so they're all kind of at least connected to this question. The argument is that you're playing offense when what we need is to play defense, that there is a strong contingent manifested in a variety of legislative initiatives that seek to undermine democracy, and especially with regards to voting requirements that are being initiated at the state level. And so how can we worry about making things better when there is a significant cadre that is trying to further undermine democracy, and shouldn't our attention be focused there instead?
So I honestly think that these are the same questions and the same projects. And I agree that the attention to voting is critical. One of our strategies out of the 6 is about empowering voters, and it is all about voter access and ease of voting. So we recommend things like same-day registration, automatic voter registration, early voting, vote centers, this kind of thing. But we also recommend universal voting. And I want to actually spend some time on that, because I think it's the solution to the problem that we're currently seeing as state legislatures are trying to reduce the ease of access to the vote. So universal voting is a policy that's been in place in many places around the world, but most notably in Australia, where it's been in place for 100 years. So it's a policy by which it's mandatory to vote. There's a minimal fine that comes with not voting. So in that regard, you start to think about voter duty the way you think about jury duty, right? Jury duty is also mandatory. There's some kind of fine or penalty if you fail to show up for your jury duty. So to say that there's voter duty with a minimal fine does not mean that you're actually required to fill in your ballot. You can turn in a blank ballot. That counts as participation. But the important thing about universal voting is that it would anchor once and for all and make fully explicit our commitment to universal suffrage. And I do think that we are watching around the country right now an erosion of the commitment to universal suffrage. And I do think we have to call the question and put on the table, are we for universal suffrage? Yes, I hope will be the resounding answer. That is what our history has been building toward and working to secure. So I do think that if we could build a movement for universal voting, it would put an end to the kinds of shenanigans that we're seeing around voter access in state legislatures. We would then all need to do the work of the technical question of figuring out how to make sure all those ballots get in everybody's hands safely and everybody gets them returned safely so the election has integrity. But it could become a technical question rather than being the political question that it's become. So I think the question can be more important, but I do think, yes, you can't make democracy better if you haven't secured democracy in the first place, and hence our recommendation for universal voting.
I'm getting some questions about federalism, and so as I hear some of your goals, I'm thinking that probably suggests a national approach, so that we're all doing something in a similar sort of way. But in reality, voting laws, civic education, all of that's going to be established at the state level, or in fact, at the local level. So how do we weigh the diversity that we get in having states and localities handle issues, as opposed to having the federal government do it?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'm an advocate for and that the report is supportive of is a project of collaborative federalism. So I think we often make the mistake of thinking that federalism means, oh, everybody just does whatever they want, states just do whatever. That's not what it means. It's not what it meant in the beginning. Federalism was not the idea that, you just do whatever. If you go back to the Federalist Papers, the argument that they make is that the national government has the job of harmonizing the interests of the state with the national interest. So the project of federalism is a project of harmonization, where every jurisdictional level has a role to play. There's a role for local authority, for state authority, for federal authority. And the question of what the role is depends on a number of things. One thing is scale. There's some things that are best done at a national scale, other things that are best done at a lower scale. But for any given project, it's quite often the case that you need a function that's at each of the different levels. So take COVID suppression as an instance. Most public health authorities do sit at the state level. And that's reasonable because there's enough variation from place to place that it would be very hard actually to have a fully nationalized approach to something like disease suppression. Disease moves depending on the shape of communities, and you really need local knowledge to understand that. That said, that fact that states have those authorities and have them for good reason doesn't mean they should be abandoned to do that work by themselves. They need investment from the federal government in doing that work. And then there are problems that they couldn't solve on their own, like supply chain issues for testing, that did require national coordination. And that's the way to think about federalism, is to ask the questions like which thing should be coordinated at a national level, which thing can and is best coordinated at a state level, and then how do we harmonize across those levels. So in our report, we have a huge amount of stuff that we recommend happen at the local level, a huge amount of stuff that we think can happen at the state level. And we try to be very targeted, in some sense limited, with regard to what we were recommending should happen at the federal level.
So if I could just follow up on that for a second. So if we're looking at something like HR1, which is this big voting rights piece of legislation in the Congress right now, and at the same time, we're seeing states increasingly put restrictions on voting. So how do we balance that? How does the federal government harmonize that? Is that an area where you think we really need something like HR1 that essentially tells the states what they're doing, or is there another way to get there?
So there is a lot of overlap between HR1 and what is in our report. There are also things that are in our report that aren't in HR1, and conversely that are in HR1 but not in our report. So there are some important and valuable things. I think, the federal government can set standards through touching this parts of our structure that are specifically federal. And I think it is important for the federal government to do that. But then I think it's also important for the federal government to convene, for example, the secretaries of states from around the country and to pull them into a community of practice that can work more effectively on questions of election integrity and securing the electoral process and systems. So, and then of course, the federal government can incentivize good behavior. And that is another way of bringing the federal government sort of into a role of harmonizing efforts and interests across the states. So data sharing, data coordination, investment, those are powerful things the federal government can do to raise practice levels across states to the place we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Chris, did you have one?
Yeah, I have a question from a student of mine, and I'm not beneath bumping her to the front of the queue. So here's her question. How do you transform the mindsets of people who don't believe that our government needs to change, or people who don't believe that the government should nourish a sense of mutual commitment?
So I think that's a great question. And I think the answer to that is through relationship building. And I know that sounds hard or crazy, because here we are, a country of 330 million people. So what does it mean to say that persuasion happens through relationship building? But in truth, that is how persuasion happens, is through relationships. And so in the work that we did in this commission, and in some related work that I've recently done on civic education that comes out next week, we've worked really hard consistently to build cross-ideological coalitions. And it is work that proceeds in time. That is, you start with a group of 12 people and you make sure that you are connecting people who wouldn't otherwise be connected. And then once you've got them connected, you add another 12, and then you've got 24, then you can add 24 more, and you've got 48, and you keep building out. And we literally at that level of relational organizing, I think, need to re-knit our connections to one another. And often people, I think, do recover an orientation towards a mutual commitment when they have a chance to work on a shared problem. So it may be that people don't want to say, oh yeah, I think we've got an issue around our mutual commitment, but they might say, yes, I think we have a problem around an issue with our forests, or we have a problem around an issue with the workforce and the absence of jobs in this particular region or place. And if we can bring people together to work on a specific shared problem, identify the problem, and then work on it, and make sure that as we work on it, we are trying to build out cross-ideological coalitions, I think then we start to have a context where we can raise the possibility that exactly what's developing is that mutual commitment, and that we're getting answers and solutions because it's emerging. So if you can model the value of that mutual commitment and that willingness to participate in team problem solving, I think it becomes easier to convince people of the need to invest in that kind of effort.
I'm getting some different questions on the role of public discourse and the role of communicating among people, especially at a time when, well, a significant percentage of the population doesn't accept the results of the last election. There seem to be, some core differences on civic values across the country. What are the sorts of discussions that you think should take place? And do you have a sense of the mechanisms for doing some of that? Or?
Yes, no, I mean, I think these are really hard questions. And let me sort of back up for a second and say, again, I do think that this is why the point about universal suffrage is so important. We need a bright line commitment to universal suffrage. And then we need to be able to have a shared technical conversation about how to ensure that there is election integrity and security. And in effect, I think what's happened is there has been erosion of that bright line commitment to universal suffrage. And then, over the course of the pandemic, we had this very difficult situation where we obviously needed to respond to the pandemic by making voting accessible despite pandemic conditions. And this, from my point of view, led to right and good decisions across our states to introduce mail-in voting and early voting and vote centers and things like that. very much support those decisions as the right thing to do in the context of a pandemic. At the same time that that's true, is also the case that to make voting much easier, a few months shortly before the election, was plainly of an advantage to the Democrats. And so that meant that although there was a good, sound, moral, and ethical basis for making these decisions and changes over the course of the summer, they were easily politicized and represented as pure political plays, pure political moves. And it's that backdrop, I think, which you have to have in mind to understand then the dissatisfaction with the election results. However, that kind of dissatisfaction is only possible if you're not committed to universal suffrage. And I think that's the thing that we really have to focus on and bring to the surface, and have that hard conversation in the country about, can we recommit to universal suffrage? That's the number one most important job I think we have to do right now.
Great. Well,
Yeah,
go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I had one other one here. That could you talk more about your thoughts about civic education, about what we need to do, about what we should do, and also how do we do that, given that this is at the state and local level, and we know how politicized discussions about anything having to do with, I guess you call social studies or anything like that, is going to become.
Sure. Well, I'm going to give you another picture of collaborative federalism in work, at work on this one. So I've just had incredible privilege and honor to co-lead a group of ultimately about 300 people working over the last 2 years to produce new national guidance for excellence in history and civic learning for all learners. We're going to release this work next week, Tuesday, March 2nd. So it's embargoed, so there's going to be a limit to what I can fully say, but I can at least describe the project in big terms. It's not a national curriculum. It's not national standards. It's not national mandates. It is funded by NEH, so the Department of Education, and it is being refunded by the Biden administration. So it's a rare moment where we actually have agreement on direction across 2 administrations. And again, we built out a big, diverse team, demographically diverse, ideologically diverse, in working on this. What it consists of is guidance, a set of themes organized by questions that we think students should encounter across the K through 12 grade bands. And the themes and questions combine history learning and civics learning. And in addition to the themes and the questions, there's a set of design challenges, the purpose of which is to put the parameters of excellence before people say, okay, you experiment all over the country. Let's experiment in diverse ways. And the important point here is that by shifting to questions, right, not answers, we are not proposing to say a priori, here's the single story we should all be telling about our history, or here's the single account of our democratic institutions that we should all be given. But what we are saying is, here are the questions that we all need to dig into and come to a judgment about, have an opinion about, questions about the story of this country's life, questions about how democracy works, and so forth. So there's a lot more to be said about that, and we've done a lot of work to make sure the questions, the design challenges, for example, ask people to experiment with how you narrate our history in ways that are honest about the wrongs of our history without slipping into cynicism, and also appreciative of the founding, honest about the goods this country has achieved without jumping over into adulation. So it's sort of set of parameters within which we think excellence will emerge. So what's going to happen with this guidance? We are recommending that districts establish civic learning plans, that they do this with support from states, that states we think should actually require civic learning plans and revise standards to support and align with the roadmap that we're developing. And then again, with regard to the federal government, we call for financial investment in the efforts of states and local districts. And we call for the federal government to support broad national data coordination. But then we also call on civil society to take responsibility for creating the content, the curricular resources that would flow into this. So this is not a governmentally created batch of material, but an open field of experimentation with diverse stakeholders all over the country participating in it. So, we're working hard on doing something that hasn't been done in a few decades, because polarization has made it quite impossible for us to sort of develop new civic learning frameworks. But again, we switch from answers to questions, And that opens up a huge amount of possibility.
Mhm.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
We've had the same kind of conversations around here. So this is a question that I thought was really good. It also reminds me of your piece in the Atlantic recently about the Constitution. And the question is, how do you expand and reaffirm institutions without also reaffirming the systematic racism that has been baked into them?
So, here I'm going to push back. And I'm going to say, yes, we do have problems of systemic racism without any question. But we actually also have precisely the tools for undermining systemic racism. And this is where it's really important to recognize that the Constitution itself was designed by people with competing views of what they were building. So the Constitution constituted a hypothesis. It was like a science experiment, okay? But you had two different groups of scientists. You had the scientists who were slaveholders and who were seeking to secure the sustainability of their life form. And their hypothesis was that this governing instrument would permit them to do that. But you also had people who were abolitionists, like Benjamin Franklin and James Wilson. And their hypothesis was that the Constitution had in it the principles that would undo enslavement, and that would initiate the inexorable end of systems of racial hierarchy and domination. So we got to test the hypothesis. We've been testing it now for almost, more than 200 years. And indeed, the hypothesis of the slaveholders was refuted. It did not support the durability of their life form over time. Rather, the principles of the Constitution help undermine practices of domination. So we are not done with the work of using the principles of the Constitution to undermine domination, but it does indeed deliver tools and resources for doing just that.
So let me just follow up quickly with that. There's also questions about the idea that, and I think it's basically the same answer, but I want to hear it from you, that there is this, within majority rule, there's been a lot of support for racist and discriminatory practices, and yet, so how do you sustain democracy without giving into those kind of inclinations? And I think I know where you're going, but I want to hear it from you.
Where I'm going is it's a mistake to think of democracy as majority rule. Majority votes are one decision-making mechanism among many. A democracy is a political form that has the job of empowering all citizens as free and equal self-governing citizens. All right, so then the question is, what combination of mechanisms do we use to empower all citizens equally and put them on an equal footing? Sometimes we have to use majority votes for certain decisions. Sometimes we actually make decisions by consensus. We also have minority protecting mechanisms. Those range from, in our Constitution, the 14th Amendment and due process of law, application of that rule to the states by the federal government, a variety of other things that are minority protecting mechanisms. You need a complete package of mechanisms, decision-making mechanisms, rights protecting mechanisms, and so forth. Taken together, they have to have the job of empowering all. So we go wrong when our mechanisms get out of whack and don't deliver that full protection and full empowerment. That brings me back to our report, really, which is why we do need to change the size of the House of Congress, because that's the fact that we capped Congress has meant that one of our minority protecting mechanisms, in this case protecting rural, less populous parts of the country, has begun to operate with too great a degree of strength. The weight needs to be shifted. We need that minority protecting mechanism, but it needs to have a little less robustness to it. And so that's all the way through our institutions. You have to pay attention to how the different mechanisms combine and work in interaction with each other, either to protect everybody and empower everybody, or to fail to do so. And the job where we see our mechanisms failing is to reform them so that, again, they can secure protection for everybody and empower everybody. And you have to meet those two criteria to actually count as a democracy, from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've talked about enlarging the size of the House and about going to ranked choice voting, and I have some other questions about how you would fix our representative democracy. And I remember in class this morning you mentioned that some recent initiatives have indicated to us how much broad support there is for certain policies like legalizing marijuana that might not be apparent in the legislatures. And I'm wondering, do you see other sorts of democratic institutions as becoming more important or playing a bigger role, like deliberative democracy or relying on initiatives and that type of thing?
That's a great question. And we do have a stretch of our report that focuses on responsiveness of government, and that does really recommend using more participatory mechanisms. And in general, yes, I think not just in our institutions, but throughout civil society, we need more participatory mechanisms. We need more power sharing. And here I really am, I'm actually sort of channeling Martin Luther King Jr., who in a posthumous essay said, people get really, sort of focused on federal laws, enforcement of federal laws. Yes, we need that for basic civil rights protection. But the truth of the matter is we actually need a real reorganization throughout all of civil society so that we can achieve power sharing throughout all of civil society. I think doing that is a matter of making much more use of deliberative and participatory mechanisms everywhere, in our universities, in our schools, in our businesses, and so forth. So there's real democratization of our culture and of all our organizations that would help, I think, a lot with the problems that we're facing.
Yeah, so along those lines, do you see reforms that would be necessary around the Supreme Court? I mean, how does the court fit into, say, your collaborative federalism model or some of the other arguments that you've made today?
Sure. Well, so I and my colleagues on the commission as well are advocates of term limits for Supreme Court justices, the idea that they should be limited to 18-year terms. This would mean that every presidential term would bring the appointment of 2 justices.
Mhm.
And so it would depoliticize the court. You just know that there's a regular beat and sequence, and every president, whichever party, was going to get a certain number of appointees, and so forth. So we do think that the court has become too politicized, and in order to restore the integrity of the judicial branch and the specific role it's supposed to play in our system, it's really important to achieve those term limits.
Mhm. Chris? Chris, you're muted.
I know. I got it. Now I got to go back and find the question.
How many times a day do we say that?
Yeah, right. So the question is from a colleague. It's about non-social media, right? He's wondering about recommendations concerning mass media and broadcasting. And he's wondering about bringing back the fairness doctrine or otherwise improving the highly degraded and partisan nature of media discussion and information transmission.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. We did not actually address the fairness doctrine, but I think it is a good question to put on the table, and is worth our digging into again without any question. So, I think the question of our media and how they function is the hardest one on the table in front of us right now, partly just because there are so many different parts of their structure and operations that we might think of adjusting. So there are lots of things to work through, but I do think that that is a good agenda item to put on the table.
Michael, do you want to bring this in for a landing?
Yeah, I've had several questions about what people should do. So one about how might young people become involved in the some of the arguments that you're making or with your organization, as well as what would it be that the commission would want from the people that are here today?
Thanks for that question. I think there are a few things. So the first is we are always very grateful when people download the report and share it with friends or take it to book groups for discussion. We think that achieving change will require a real national conversation about these subjects. And so we would be grateful if you spread the conversation. That itself is exceptionally valuable. A second thing that we'd be grateful for is take a look at the recommendations, find one that resonates with you specifically, and then find the champions that are working on it. They need help in all kinds of ways. Sometimes they actually just need volunteers. Sometimes they need folks who are going to make donations. Sometimes they need folks who are going to set up chapters or related allied organizations in another locality. So that's another way that you can directly get involved. So I think then a third thing to do is to focus on that last point I just made about power sharing. And that is about, take a look at this, especially the section on responsive institutions, and consider where you sit in the world. What organizations are you a part of? Can you help your own organization do a better job of power sharing whether internally or externally with outside stakeholders who are from less well-advantaged positions or maybe different points of view. So I think those three things would really advance the cause of the health of our constitutional democracy.
Mhm. Well, it's always an indication of a really good talk when we can't get through nearly half the questions that we've got. So there's still a lot out there. But I'm going to use this opportunity to thank you for a fascinating discussion. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Great questions. Thank you so much for that engagement. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And it was good to virtually see you. So we see lots of names on the attendee list that we've seen before. So thank you for coming back.
Alrighty. Take
Thank
care.
you. Have a good day.
See you next time.
All right.